She kept the letter in her left coat pocket for the entire crossing. Not folded, not sealed, just pressed flat against the lining. The paper softened by now from handling, the ink smudged along the crease where her thumb had worried it at the Snake River, and again on the long climb into the Blue Mountains, when the wagon tilted so hard to the left that she was certain it would go down the ravine and take all of them with it. The letter said his name was Thomas Harding. It said he had a farm in the Willamette Valley, 112 acres of it, and that the house had a porch facing east so you could watch the sun come up over the hills every morning. It said he was 36 years old, sober, God-fearing, and lonely in a way that had made him write to a marriage broker in St. Louis rather than say so to anyone he actually knew. Ruth Alcott had read that letter so many times on the trail that she could recite it in the dark. She had done so, lying on her bedroll beneath the wagon, the canvas above her snapping in the prairie wind, whispering the words to herself like a prayer or remedy. Porch facing east, 112 acres. A man who is lonely in a decent way. She had believed every word of it. That was the first thing she would think about later, when all of it was over. She had believed every single word, and she had been 29 years old and not a fool, and she had believed it anyway. She had taught school for 6 years at the Walnut Street Academy in Cincinnati, Ohio. She was good at it, genuinely good, the kind of teacher children remember when they are grown, the one who found the particular thing in each child that wanted to be found. It had paid her enough to live and given her almost nothing else. She had spent those years in the same 3 rooms above a candle shop on 5th Street, the smell of tallow drifting up through the floorboards in the evenings, the street noise rising and fading with the seasons, her window looking out onto a yard where nothing grew because nothing was planted. She had learned to read other people's lives in those years, the children's home situations legible in their lunches and their posture and the way they flinched or didn't flinch when voices were raised. She had become, without planning it, a woman who understood a great deal about what was happening around her and very little about how to change her own portion of it. Her father had died of fever in 1852. Her mother had remarried within the year. A man named Gerald who was not unkind exactly but who was not her father, and who had made it quietly, consistently clear that Ruth's presence in the house was a convenience when it was needed and an inconvenience the rest of the time. She had stayed too long. She had known she was staying too long and had stayed anyway, the way you do when your options feel more like walls than doors. There was a particular shame in that kind of staying, not dramatic enough to force a decision, not comfortable enough to ever feel like a choice, just an accumulation of days in which you told yourself that next year would be different, and next year arrived and wasn't. And then one morning in January of 1858, she had read an advertisement in the back of the Cincinnati Gazette, and she had written a letter to a brokerage in St. Louis, and 3 months later there was a response from a man named Thomas Harding who had 112 acres and a porch facing east and a loneliness he had put into writing, and she had written back and he had written back, and by the 1st of April she had said yes. She had not told her mother until the day before she left. That conversation had taken place in the kitchen, the same kitchen where Ruth had peeled apples and learned her letters and cried after her father's funeral, the room that held more of her history than any other room she had ever stood in. Her mother had said very little. She had looked at Ruth across the table with an expression that was equal parts grief and guilt, and something else that Ruth could not name then and only named much later, relief. The relief of a woman who had not known how to let her daughter go and had been waiting for her daughter to go anyway. Ruth had cried on the street outside. She had cried hard enough that a woman passing by had stopped and asked if she was all right. And Ruth had said yes and meant it and didn't mean it in equal measure. That was the last time she cried until the Snake River. The wagon train left Independence, Missouri on the 14th of May. Ruth had never seen anything like the gathering, 250 wagons or more assembled in those muddy streets, oxen bawling, children chasing dogs between the wheels, women calling names into noise that didn't stop. She had arranged to travel with a family named Coulter from Indiana, paying her way in cooking and in teaching their youngest 2 children their letters each evening by the fire. They were good people, the Coulters, solid, careful, generous in the quiet way of farm families who understand that resources are real and kindness is also real and neither one cancels out the other. Mrs. Coulter was the first person Ruth told about Thomas Harding. Standing at the fire somewhere along the Platte River in early June, the mosquitoes thick in the evening air, the Platte itself spread wide and shallow to their left, more sand than water in places, Mrs. Coulter had listened without interrupting and then said, "Well, some men are better in letters than in person, and some are better in person than in letters, and you won't know which kind he is until you get there." Ruth had held that thought like a stone in her palm for the next 3.5 months. The Platte Valley itself was a thing she had not expected. Not beautiful, exactly, and not ugly, but something that operated outside those categories entirely. It went on for weeks. The river spread itself across a plain so flat that the horizon felt like a rumor, a thing you were always approaching and never reaching, and the sky above it was so large that some of the women in the train had trouble sleeping at first, unsettled by the scale of a darkness that had no edges. The trail ran beside the river and the river ran between low sandy banks and the grass on either side was tall enough in June to hide a child, and by July it was dry enough to crackle underfoot. There were graves along the Platte. This was the thing nobody in Independence had told her about with sufficient plainness. The graves. Wooden markers mostly, sometimes just a stone with initials scratched into it, names and dates and sometimes a sentence, beloved wife or God's own child or, in one case that stayed with her, simply she tried. She had stopped in front of that one for a long moment before the Coulter wagon pulled her forward again. She had not been able to make herself walk past it quickly. They passed Chimney Rock in late June, that strange column of earth rising out of the Nebraska plain as if placed there by a hand that meant something by it, and every woman in the train went quiet when it came into view on the morning horizon. There was something about it that made the journey real in a way the weeks of walking had not yet managed. It was in the letters home that everyone wrote. It was the landmark that meant you were, finally, undeniably on the trail. That this was not a long camping trip but a one-way passage, and the world you had left was now genuinely behind you. Ruth stood and looked at it for a long time. She thought about the women who had stood in this exact spot before her, looking at this exact formation, holding their own letters or their own fears or their own versions of 112 acres and a porch facing east. There were more of them than history had bothered to count. She knew that, and it helped her, and she filed it away beside Mrs. Coulter's stone. Fort Laramie came at the end of June. A rough collection of buildings and noise and the smell of horses and unwashed men and something cooking that might have been meat, might have been something else. Women traded what they had grown tired of carrying for things they thought they'd need in the mountains ahead. Ruth traded a second pair of boots, good ones, Cincinnati ones, the kind that were right for the life she'd had and wrong for the one she was heading toward, for a heavier wool blanket and a small iron pot with a lid. She did not regret the boots. She had stopped wearing them 3 weeks in. The trail had opinions about footwear, and Ruth had learned to defer to them. They crossed South Pass in late July at 7,412 feet, the air thin and cold even in the heat of summer, and she understood for the first time what it meant to be at the divide between one world and another. The water on one side draining east toward everything she had left, the water on the other side draining west toward everything she was going. A Coulter ox died near Fort Bridger. Ruth helped redistribute the load herself, hauling flour sacks until her back ached for 3 days after, and did not write about it in her next letter to Thomas. She did not want to arrive seeming like someone who complained before she had even gotten there. The Snake River crossing was the one she returned to in her dreams afterward, for years. The water ran gray-green and fast, far colder than its color could tell you. Cold in the way of something that has come down from inside a mountain and has not yet learned how to be warm. The wagon ahead of theirs went sideways in the current. A child's voice coming from somewhere inside the canvas. 2 men on horseback riding in hard from the downstream bank. They lost no one that day. They lost a wheel and most of a flour barrel and one of Mr. Coulter's good boots, but no one went under, and when Ruth sat on the far bank afterward with the sun on her wet skirts and her hands pressed flat to the ground, she breathed until her heartbeat came back to her. She had been one of the people who waded in to help pull the other wagon to shore, up to her hips in the current, the cold taking the breath clean out of her chest. Nobody mentioned it afterward. It was the kind of thing you did and then moved past, because there was always more trail ahead and the trail did not wait. She did not cry until she was underneath the Coulter wagon that night. Her wet hair dried by then to something stiff and strange, and she cried quietly, the kind of crying that is not grief exactly but the body releasing something it has been holding at great cost. The way a fist opens when it finally has to. The Blue Mountains came at the end of August, the aspens already turning gold against the dark timber, the smell of pine sap and cold water and distance coming down through the passes. Ruth had not expected to find them beautiful. Everything else on the trail had been beautiful in the way that indifferent things are beautiful. The Platte sunsets, the sage plain after rain, Chimney Rock against a white sky. Beautiful in a way that required nothing from you and offered nothing back. The Blue Mountains were different. They were beautiful in the way of something that recognized you. She could not have explained it then and did not try. She simply walked through them, her lungs pulling in the cold air, her eyes on the timber and the stone, and felt, for the first time since leaving Cincinnati, that she was somewhere she was meant to be. Not in the sense of destiny, which she had always thought a lazy explanation for things, but in the smaller and more honest sense that this place and this moment and this particular cold and this particular light were hers, and she was grateful for them. By the time they reached the Dalles in early September, Ruth's boots were cracked at the sole and her dress, the green one she had packed to arrive in, had been borrowed against the cold so many times it no longer looked like itself. She said goodbye to the Coulters with real feeling, the particular grief of parting from people who have seen you at your worst and thought no less of you for it. She rode the last 40 miles into the Willamette Valley in the back of a freight wagon driven by a man named Price who spoke only to his mules. Thomas Harding's farm sat at the end of a lane marked by 2 oak trees. The house was smaller than she had imagined from the letters, one main room with a loft and a lean-to addition on the north side. But the porch faced east, exactly as he had written, and there were marigolds planted along the front of it, orange and yellow going bronze at the edges in the September cool, and she saw those marigolds and something in her chest that had been rigid for 4 months let go, just slightly. Price set her bag down in the lane and drove off without ceremony. She picked it up and walked toward the porch. The door opened before she reached the steps. He was tall, Thomas Harding, and dark-haired, going gray at the temples, with the weathered look of a man who had spent years working in outdoor light, careful eyes, large hands, the particular stillness of someone who has learned not to move quickly around animals or strangers. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and she could see in his face the same arithmetic she was working in her own. Is this the person? Is this who I have been imagining for 5 months? He said her name, Miss Alcott, quietly, and she said his back, Mr. Harding, and they stood for a moment in the September afternoon with 4 months of letters between them and 2,000 miles of trail behind her, and the awkwardness of 2 people meeting each other for the first time after already telling each other a great deal. Then a voice came from inside the house. A woman's voice, level and tired. It said, "Thomas. Is that the girl?" Ruth watched Thomas Harding's face change. She had been a teacher for 6 years. She had learned to read a room before a word was spoken. She saw him close his eyes, briefly, just for a moment, the way a man does when he is preparing to say something he has been putting off. She saw his jaw set. She saw him turn back toward the interior of the house, and she watched the set of his shoulders, and she understood before he said a single word that something was wrong in a way his letters had not prepared her for. The woman in the doorway was perhaps 35, brown-haired, pale, thinner than she had probably been in better times, the look of someone who had been very ill and was only recently on the other side of it. She stood with one hand on the doorframe and looked at Ruth with an expression that was not unkind but was not welcoming either. It was the expression of a woman who had already been through more than was fair and was very tired and had not expected this particular complication. Her name was Clara. She was Thomas Harding's wife. or had been, or was still, legally, certainly? That question, Ruth would come to understand, was the one nobody in that yard was yet equipped to answer. In the summer of 1855, cholera had swept through the valley near Salem where Thomas and Clara were then living. Thomas had received word through a neighbor that Clara had died of the illness while visiting her sister in Portland. He had mourned. He had sold that farm and started over on this one, 40 miles south. He had spent 2 years in a grief that was also, underneath it, a relief he did not let himself examine, because Clara and he had not been unhappy exactly, but they had not been happy either, and the guilt of that complexity made the grief heavier and stranger than simple grief would have been. And eventually, the way the plain need to continue overtakes even complicated sorrow, he had written to the broker in St. Louis, Clara had not died. She had been so ill for so long that she could not send word, and in the confusion of that epidemic summer, no one else had thought to send it for her. By the time she recovered, Thomas was gone from Salem without forwarding address. It had taken her the better part of 2 years. 2 years of working in other people's kitchens and asking questions of every freight driver and traveling minister she could find, to trace him to this farm. She had arrived 6 weeks before Ruth did. Thomas told Ruth all of this standing in the yard, his hat turning in his hands, his eyes fixed on the ground before him. He told it clearly and without excuses, with the painful honesty of a man who has run out of good options and has chosen the honest one as the least bad remaining. He said he had written to the broker immediately when Clara arrived, to stop the correspondence, but that the letter had apparently not arrived in time. He said he was sorry. She believed that he was. It helped almost nothing. Ruth stood very still while he spoke. She had learned, somewhere between the Platte River and the Snake River crossing, that stillness was something you could choose, that it was a form of control when all other forms had been taken from you. When Thomas finished, she asked one question. How far is Oregon City? He said 40 miles north. She asked if there was work there for a school teacher. He said he believed there might be. She said, I see, and she picked up her bag, and she turned to look for Price's wagon. Price was gone. His mules had taken him back up the lane and around the oak trees and out of sight while Thomas was talking, and the lane was empty in both directions, and the September light was going gold across the fields, and Ruth was standing in a farmyard in the Willamette Valley with 40 miles between her and the next place she might go and nothing in her pocket to cover the distance. She stayed that night because there was nowhere else to go. Thomas gave her the lean-to room, a bed, a small window, a hook on the wall for her coat, the smell of pine boards, and the sound of a creek somewhere behind the house. She lay in the dark and listened to the quiet of the Willamette Valley and thought that it was not so different from the quiet of the prairie when you got right down to it. Not peaceful, just vast, just the sound of a place that would continue existing regardless of what happened to Ruth Alcott. She had thought, on the trail, that what she was most afraid of was the crossing itself. The rivers, the mountain passes, the cholera camps they had skirted quickly, the smell of wood smoke and something underneath it that everyone silently agreed not to name. But lying in the lean-to in the dark, she understood that what she had actually been afraid of all along was this: arriving somewhere to find that nothing was waiting, that she had spent 4 months and 2,000 miles and everything she had on a life that had, quietly and without malice, simply not been there. She was afraid of it still. She was afraid of it now with a precision that felt almost like clarity. And then, beneath the fear, she found something else, something smaller and steadier, the way bedrock presents itself below disturbed soil. She had crossed the Snake River. She had hauled flour sacks at Fort Bridger. She had stood at South Pass in thin mountain air and watched the continent divide itself around her feet. She had done all of that. Whatever came next would require less of her than what was already behind her, and she would meet it the same way she had met the rest, one morning at a time, one foot in front of the other, until the distance became distance she had covered. In the morning she got up before sunrise and went to the kitchen and found the flour and the salt and the lard and the cast-iron skillet, and she made biscuits. She made them the way her mother had taught her, with more lard than anyone thought was necessary, and she made them well. When Thomas came downstairs, and then Clara, separately, carefully, each pretending not to notice the timing of the other. Ruth set plates in front of them both and poured the coffee and sat down herself. Clara looked at her with those tired eyes. Thomas looked at her the way a man looks at something he cannot categorize. Neither of them said anything. They ate. There were children. Thomas's, from the years with Clara, a boy named Eli, 9 years old, dark-haired like his father, who watched everything from behind a careful expression, and a girl named May, 7, who had her mother's pallor and her father's stillness and a curiosity she was not yet sure she was allowed to show. On the second morning, without asking permission, Ruth brought the slate board from her bag and sat down on the porch steps and told May she was going to teach her a letter. May looked toward the kitchen window. Clara, after a moment, nodded. By the fourth morning, Eli had settled himself on the step beside his sister without being asked, pretending he was only there by accident. Ruth was good with children. She had always known it, but the trail had made her more certain. The Coulter children, the other children who had drifted to her fire in the evenings along the Platte, the small bodies that learned to trust her quickly and without explanation, she taught May and Eli in the mornings. In the afternoons, she made herself useful. The garden, the mending, the water from the creek in buckets that were heavier than they looked. She did not think about what came next. She had decided, without fully articulating it, that thinking about what came next required a steadiness she did not yet have, and so she was building the steadiness first, one morning at a time, one biscuit and one slate board at a time, until she could look at the question without flinching. She watched Clara, too, in those first weeks, carefully, without appearing to. Clara was not the woman Ruth had constructed in her mind during the long night in the lean-to. Ruth had expected either tragedy or menace, the two available shapes for this particular story, and Clara was neither. She was a woman who had survived something enormous and was tired in the way of those who have been surviving for so long that they have forgotten what it felt like not to have to. She moved through the house with the economy of someone who has learned that effort is finite and must be spent carefully. She was not tender with the children in the way Ruth's mother had been tender, or the way the Coulter women were tender. Openly, physically, with hands that found children without thinking about it. But she watched Eli and May with a steadiness that Ruth recognized as its own form of love, the undemonstrative kind. The kind that shows up every morning regardless. At the end of the first week, Clara told Thomas at dinner that she was leaving. She said it quietly, the way she seemed to say most things, without drama, with the particular flatness of a woman whose capacity for performance has been worn completely away. She said there was a man in Portland she had met at the Dalles on her journey out, a merchant named Fowler. He had offered her a position. She said position and did not specify, and nobody asked. She said she was going to go to him. She said she would leave at the end of the month when the Hendersons from the next farm went into Oregon City for supplies. Thomas said all right. Just those two words, in a voice that was even and gave nothing away. Ruth watched him after dinner, while Clara was putting the children to bed. She watched him sit at the table with the lamp and the harness he was mending, and she thought about the sentence in his third letter, the one about being lonely in a way that made you put it in writing rather than say it out loud to anyone you knew. And she understood, with a sadness that surprised her in its generosity, that Thomas Harding had been lonely for a great deal longer than 2 years, that the loneliness had been present even when Clara was in the house, that some people carry it inside them like a room with no windows, and other people can walk in and out of the house without ever finding the door. She didn't say any of this. She passed him the thread when he needed it. 3 days later, Ruth noticed. She had been a school teacher, yes, but she had also grown up as the oldest girl among 4 younger siblings, and had spent her adult life among women, and there were certain things you learned to see without being told. The way Clara moved in the mornings, careful, deliberate, the way you move when your body has become unpredictable to you, the color of her face in the early light, the way she ate or did not eat, and then overcompensated in the evenings with something plain and starchy, the way she went very still sometimes when the children were loud, as if the noise was reaching her from a slightly different distance than it should. Ruth knew. She turned it over for 2 more days. What it meant, what Fowler in Portland would be receiving along with Clara, whether he knew, whether Clara intended to tell him, what happened to a woman in that situation if the man she was going to was not the kind of man you could tell things to. She thought about all of it with the same systematic practicality she had brought to the river crossings and the Coulter children's arithmetic, and she made her decision. She found Clara alone in the garden on a Tuesday morning, kneeling at the edge of the bean rows, pulling the last of the autumn weeds with her bare hands. The sky was the pale blue of the Oregon fall, clear and cold, the hills going rust and gold in every direction. Ruth sat down on the ground beside her, which was apparently not what Clara had expected, because she looked up with something almost like alarm. Ruth said, without preamble, "I think there's something you haven't told Mr. Fowler yet." Clara was still for a moment. She said, "I don't know what you mean." Ruth said, "Yes, you do." The silence that followed had a weight to it. Clara sat back on her heels and looked at the hills for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "What are you going to do?" Ruth said, "I'm going to find you someone to talk to." She did not tell Thomas. It was not her place, and she knew it with a certainty that did not require explanation. What she did was ride to the nearest settlement with Eli on the plow horse and find the Methodist minister and, through him, his wife, a woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who was small and direct and possessed of the kind of practical competence that is more valuable in a difficulty than any amount of sentiment. Mrs. Pruitt arranged word to be sent ahead to Portland. Fowler, to his credit, moved the date of the wedding forward by 3 weeks. Ruth heard this through the minister later. She thought about it for a moment and went back to the bean rows. Clara left on a Monday morning at the end of October in the Henderson wagon, with her bag and a traveling basket and 2 children standing on the porch watching her go. Thomas stood by the lane with his hat in his hands. Ruth stood at the edge of the garden. Eli pressed himself briefly against her arm in the way of children trying to be brave. She put her hand on his shoulder and kept it there until the Henderson wagon was fully out of sight around the oak trees, and when she felt him exhale, the long, slow exhale of a child letting go of something, she did not say anything at all. Some moments require silence more than witness, and she had learned to tell the difference. The farm was quieter after that. Not empty. Eli and May were enough noise for most purposes, but quieter in the particular way of a place that has been holding its breath and finally, slowly, lets it go. Ruth continued to wake before sunrise, and make the biscuits and teach the children and haul the water and mend what needed mending, and the days accumulated into November without anyone making any declarations about what came next, and she let them. The Oregon autumn turned. The marigolds went to frost and then to dried stems in their row, but they stood, the stalks patient in the November cold, still holding their shape, still marking the line of the porch the same way they had when she arrived. Ruth made a point of noting this each morning when she went out to the creek for water. Not as a symbol, exactly. She was not given to symbols, more as a simple fact she wished to keep in view. Things that go dormant are not the same as things that are gone. Thomas did not speak much about what had happened. Neither did she. They had developed, without planning it, a way of being in the same rooms that was useful and comfortable, and did not require either of them to name what it was. He repaired the porch railing she had mentioned was loose, without comment. She reorganized the kitchen shelves so things could be found without looking, without comment. He brought in extra firewood before she asked for it. She mended his coat without being asked. These were small gestures. In a life where the large gestures had already been spent, small ones accumulate into something, and the something they accumulate into is, in the end, not so different from what people mean when they use the larger word. She was beginning to understand that. She held the understanding carefully, the way you hold something that might break if you look at it too directly. In November he brought out the letters. He set them on the table between them. The ones he had written, the ones she had written back. All of them tied together with a length of twine, worn at the folds, softened from handling the same as hers. He said he'd like to read one, if she'd allow it. She said he could. He picked up the 3rd letter she had written, the one from February, The one she had spent 3 evenings working on because she had wanted to explain herself without sounding like a woman running from something. Since she had not wanted to be that woman, even though she had not been entirely certain she wasn't. He read it quietly, and then he read one passage aloud. The part where she had written, "I am not asking for a great deal. I am asking for a place where I chose to be." He set the letter down. He looked at her. He said, "Is that still what you want?" She thought about it as honestly as she knew how. She thought about Cincinnati and Gerald and the Walnut Street Academy. She thought about the cold of the Snake River and the smell of the Blue Mountains coming down through the passes and Mrs. Coulter saying you won't know which kind he is until you get there. She thought about Eli with his letters on the porch and May reading aloud with her finger under each word, sounding them out, the pride in her voice when the sounds became something she recognized. She thought about the grave marker along the plat she tried, and she thought about what it meant that someone had put those 2 words on a stone for a woman to carry across 2,000 miles of country, and what it meant that Ruth had read them and kept going. She thought about the marigolds, gone to frost now but still standing in their row, the dried stems patient in the November cold, and the fact that she knew, with a solidity that surprised her in how little she had to argue for it, that they would come back in the spring. She said yes, not a promise, not a declaration, just an honest answer to an honest question, offered across a kitchen table in the Willamette Valley in November of 1858 by a woman who had crossed 2,000 miles to find that what she had come for was not what had been waiting, and had found, in the finding of that, something she had not expected and could not have named in any letter she had written. Thomas nodded once, in the careful way of a man receiving something he is not certain he has earned. He tied the letters back together with the twine and set them on the shelf beside the Bible. They stayed there for the rest of their lives. Ruth wrote to her sister in Cincinnati that winter, the first letter she had sent since arriving. She described the farm. She described the east-facing porch and said the marigolds would come back in the spring, and she intended to be there to see them. She wrote that the children were learning to read, and that Eli had lately shown a particular aptitude for arithmetic that pleased her. She wrote that the winters in the Willamette Valley were cold in the way of a place that takes itself seriously, and that she had been given a wool coat of a quality she would not have been able to afford in Ohio, and that she wore it every morning when she went to the creek. She did not try to explain everything. Some things, she had learned, are not made for letters. You can write around the edge of them and the reader who knows you will understand what the words are circling. In the spring, the marigolds came back. Every last one. She was on the porch when they broke through. A Thursday morning in April, the light still cool and the hills still green before the summer dried them. Eli reading on the step below her, May asleep inside. She saw the first orange tip push through the soil at the end of the row, and she sat with it the way you sit with something you knew was coming and are still glad of when it arrives. Thomas came around the corner of the house with a fence post on his shoulder, saw what she was looking at, and stopped. He set the post down. He stood beside her for a moment in the April morning. He did not say anything, neither did she. There was nothing that needed saying. The marigolds were back, and she was there to see them, and she had known she would be. She signed her letters to her sister the way she always had. Your Ruth, who is exactly where she means to be.